fine. Good. Fine, yeah. Yeah, this will be fun.
General Adam Gelb, nice to see you.
Hello, John. How are you? Good to see you.
Hi, John. Heather Child. So nice to meet you.
How's your son doing? What is he doing? Yeah, oh, I knew that. Yeah.
Look at this.
I heard his name being bandied about.
If I can get people to come in and take their seats, we'll go ahead and get started. Come on in, everybody. We want to get started promptly because I know everyone wants to get to Union Station, so we're going to band promptly.
I know everybody wants to get to Union Station, so we want to get started.
That is not me, is it? That little buzzing there?
Might be my iPad.
Hey, Bill. Come on in. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. If somebody could close that door in the back. I have no idea what that humming is. Or, well, yeah, all right, but I don't know whether I'm talking too close to it, too far away. All right. In any event, welcome to the breakout session for the Criminal Law Practice Group. My name is John Malcolm. I'm the chairman of the Criminal Law Practice Group. I do want to put in a plug for us. We're actually a very, very active practice group. We put on a number of programs throughout the year. We are always interested in getting other people involved in our practice group. If you're interested in engaging in some activity or certainly being considered to join our executive committee, I will be here throughout the convention, and so please feel free to come up and talk to me and reach out. We have a really quite timely and important panel discussion today called What Should Be Done to Address Rising Crime Rates? I suppose one question that some of our panelists may wish to address is whether in fact we are really having rising crime rates. There's no question that there has been a very disturbing spike in violent crime in some areas like Memphis, Baltimore, certainly Chicago, while crime rates, including violent crime rates, have continued to drop in some areas, including some major urban areas like New York City. This is all tied up, of course, in the criminal justice reform movement, and whether this movement is a smart idea or a misguided attempt to tinker with an issue that could lead to bad consequences and return to high crime rates that existed in decades past. We have a tremendous panel, a diverse panel, to explore these important topics, and we are very, very fortunate to have an excellent person to guide us through this discussion in Justice David Stras of the Minnesota Supreme Court. And hopefully, I'll put in my personal plug, soon to be Judge David Stras of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. And with that, let me turn it over to him. Justice Stras.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. I think we have a wonderful panel, and I'll give you a little brief introduction as to what the plan is. We have 5 panelists. We have a very robust topic, and we're going to move, at least in my estimation, from the more general issues surrounding why we see the spike in violent crime rates to more specific issues, including talking about some of the remedies for it and things like that, as John mentioned. My view is we're going to spend about 7 or so minutes with each panelist to give opening statements. Then I may ask a question or two to get the discussion going. But I'm hopeful that all of you will have questions for our panelists as well, because that always makes the panel more fun and more interesting with audience participation. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I hope we all learned something from this wonderful panel. Our first speaker is Adam Gelb. He's the director of the Pew Public Safety Performance Project, and he oversees Pew's assistance to states seeking an improvement in public safety based on corrections spending. Working in crime control and prevention issues for 3 decades, Gelb has worked on all sides of criminal justice issues. First as a journalist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, congressional aide for the Senate Judiciary Committee, and senior state government official as the policy director for the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland from 1995 until 2000. Gelb graduated from the University of Virginia and holds a master's degree from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And without further ado, I introduce Adam Gelb.
Thanks, Justice. Appreciate it. Good afternoon. You said we'll start with the general, and I definitely want to do that. What we discussed is I would set a little bit of the background for this discussion, a little bit of historical background, trends in crime and incarceration, and discuss a little bit what the role of incarceration was. And though the title is what we should do about violent crime, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we should not do, which is build more prisons. With respect to the trends, we were going to do PowerPoints as well and kind of decided not to go that way, so bear with me a second here. If you think about the crime trend over time as a two-humped camel, you have a long and steady rise up to a peak in about 1980, and then a little bit of a trough and another peak in 1991, and then another drop-off from 1991 till now, the end of 2016. So a two-humped camel, with 1991 being the most recent peak of both violent and property crime rates. And where we are now in both violent and property crime is about half of where we were in those 1991 peaks, with a significant uptick in violent crime in the last 2 years. Now, I think about incarceration, and I hate to do this, but the closest sort of word picture that I could come up with here was think about Al Gore's carbon dioxide emissions, the inconvenient truth graph, where incarceration looks just like that. It's flat, flat, flat from about the 1920s up till the early 1970s, and then starts spiking. Carbon emissions did that around 1950, so sort of moved that forward 20 years. Incredible stability of punishment or incarceration in this country, really, between 1920, 1970, and then a steady rise 5 times over that period of time. The incarceration rate increased to the point in 2008 where we had 1 out of every 100 adults in this country behind bars. I'll just pause on that for those who hadn't heard that or sink that in a little bit. 1% of the adult population in this country was either in prison or jail in 2008. And in the past 10 years or so, that has ticked down somewhat. It's down about 13% since that 2008 peak. So what we had, if you put those two things visually together, is this critical period in the 1990s where crime was coming down while prisons were going up. And what that did for a lot of people in their minds was create what we kind of sometimes call the iron law of crime and incarceration, which is just as simple as that. The prisons go up, crime goes down, and almost the inverse of that, which is that if prisons were to go down, then crime would go back up. And so I'd like to just focus for a minute on whether that's in fact the case and how critical that is, because if we actually want to reverse what we're seeing in the last couple of years with respect to violent crime increases, we've got to understand what's going on, in particular why crime dropped so dramatically from the early 90s over the last 15 or so years. So I think about this in 2 buckets. One bucket is things that government did, government policy and programs, and then there's a whole bucket of things that were outside the scope of government action. In that first bucket, the things that people think of most often are better policing and more incarceration. With respect to policing, police got much better data about where crime happens, when it happens, and focused efforts on hotspots and problem solving in those particular areas, and also much better information about who was committing crime, which we sometimes call hot dots. So we have hotspots and hot dots, and a significant improvement overall in the effectiveness in policing and preventing crime. The second piece is more incarceration, and a lot of people want to make the argument that the increase in incarceration had nothing whatsoever to do with the drop in crime, and I don't think that's what the research shows. The research shows that it did. The increase in imprisonment took a lot of bad guys off the street, and that clearly had something to do with the reduction in crime. We'll return to that in a minute. Then there's this bucket of things outside of what government has done. I'm going to list them here quickly. Changing demographics. The average age of the U.S. population has risen over this period of time. As we all know, crime is a young man's game, and so we have an older population, less crime. The economy obviously was generally favorable throughout the 1990s, with a recession in the early 2000s, but picked back up again until about 2008. Obviously, the crack cocaine epidemic reached its peak early in that period and then started to wane for a number of reasons. And then there's some really kind of interesting things that most people don't often think of as related to why crime dropped. There's been a huge expansion of anti-crime technologies, whether that's home burglar alarms and other things like that, or particularly car anti-theft systems. Car theft in this country dropped more than 90% from its peak, largely due to making cars harder to steal and easy to recover if they were, and certainly enforcement against chop shops as well. There's been a huge increase in private security systems and private security guards over this period. There's a lot of research into lead exposure and the reduction in the number of particularly kids who are exposed to lead, which is connected to aggressive and violent behavior. And finally, this is kind of one of the most fascinating ones, I think, that actually has some good research behind it, which is that there's less cash out there. People have moved to plastic, and benefits have been transferred to electronic benefits rather than people getting cash for various kinds of payments, and people just carry around less cash with them and are therefore less sort of ripe targets for robbery and theft. So back quickly to prisons. In all that mix, nobody has a fancy computer regression equation that they can put all these factors in and say this is how much exactly accounted for what percentage of the crime reduction. But the best research shows that the increase in incarceration caused about 25%, maybe as much as 25% of that precipitous crime drop we've seen since the early 1990s. And I just want to take the last couple minutes here to make some points about that ironclad relationship that's etched in many people's minds, and the argument that more prisons don't necessarily ensure less crime. The first is, many people assume, if you look at this at the state level, you'll see that states with higher incarceration rates are going to have lower crime rates. It's actually not the case. States with higher incarceration rates have higher crime rates, reflecting those higher crime rates, not driving them down. An example would be Oklahoma has nearly double the incarceration rate that North Carolina does, same crime rate. And you find that in many examples. The next, if you take a look at the last 5 years where we've had this declining crime and incarceration, we're really seeing that you can reduce crime and incarceration at the same time. In fact, 31 states over the 2010 to 2015 period have reduced both their crime rates and the incarceration rates at the same time. And fascinatingly, the drop in crime has been bigger in the states that have had the biggest reductions in imprisonment than it was in the states actually where prisons continue to grow over this period. Last couple examples here. We looked at drug offenses. Obviously, the theory behind locking up a lot more people for drug offenses was that it would reduce the amount of problems we were having in society because of drugs. So we looked at that at the state level at Pew recently and lined up state drug imprisonment rates with drug arrest rates on a statewide level, drug abuse rates, and overdose deaths. And we found no correlation whatever between those things. So if the theory was more drug imprisonment leads to reduced arrests and drug usage rates and overdose death, that did not occur. And the last example I give would be around felony theft. As the Justice mentioned, we at Pew have worked with about 3 dozen states around the country at this point on various reforms as part of what we call the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. Many of those states have raised the felony theft threshold, that dollar amount at which the amount of goods that you steal can trigger felony level penalties, a year or more in prison. And there are 30-plus states that have done this at this point, and you'd think if you looked at their property crime rates, you would see some increase in theft rates after a state had raised those felony thresholds. As it turns out, there's no difference whatsoever. Those trends have continued down regardless of the increase in that threshold and therefore the reduction in the penalties. So Justice, I would just conclude there by saying the recent increases in violence are troubling and tragic, and they do deserve a response and a research-backed response. And that would point us away from increased incarceration.
All right, thank you, Adam. And just so you don't think I've already lost control of the panel, we did decide as a group on the conference call that Adam would set the stage for the panel, and so we gave him a little bit more time to talk through some of the background statistics. So, and I really appreciate that because I think it was very helpful to set the stage for our other panelists. So our second speaker is Heather Childs, who is currently the Vice President of Compliance at Capital One. In addition to serving as a law clerk to Judge Emilio Garza, and as an assistant United States attorney, she became a trial attorney for the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice. She also worked in the Obama White House as Deputy Associate Counsel for Presidential Personnel in 2011. Notably, she served as Associate Deputy Attorney General and Chief of Staff to Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates. Prior to that, she served as Senior Counsel to the Deputy Attorney General, and I very much look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here this afternoon and here to discuss this most important topic. And I'm quite honored and humbled to serve on this distinguished panel, so thank you so much to the fellow panelists. We're here to look at a two-faceted question. Number one, what is happening with crime in America, and particularly violent crime? And then number two, what should we do about it? When it comes to what's happening with crime in America, I think Adam gave you a really great overview as to what has happened historically and what is happening today. I want to zero in on two important facts he talked about. Number one, overall crime, both violent crime and property crime, is down. It's at the lowest level it's been since 1966, according to the most recent FBI statistics. That said, we have had sharp increases in violent crime in a handful of cities in America. So if you look at the increase over the past 2 years, say you look at the increase from last year to this, there are 5 cities that accounted for more than 50% of the increase in homicides alone. Those 5 cities were Chicago, Baltimore, Los Angeles, Houston, and San Antonio. So when you think about violent crime and what it looks like, it's so important to realize that it is pocketed and in discrete places in America. And so when we ask the question as to what causes it and what we should do about it, we should focus in, I think, on those areas that have been experiencing the increases and asking the evidence-based difficult questions of what is causing an increase in homicides, an increase in violent crime in these particular cities, and then as a law enforcement response, how do we address it? And so I think that's the most important premise to keep in mind here, is that it's not all of America in every city and every community and every town. Places like Miami, Detroit, Oakland, Philadelphia, places you wouldn't quite expect, have actually experienced decreases in homicide. So when looking at what to do about it, I think of it as targeting those cities and going there and digging in and figuring out on a research level what is actually causing the uptick. A couple of years ago, when we first started seeing an increase in violent crime, I was at the Justice Department, and we pulled together a group of police chiefs and sheriffs, leading sheriffs from those areas experiencing the increases, and they had some ideas as to what the causes might be. They, speculated. They had gut reactions as to what the causes would be. They thought gang violence. They thought easier access to guns than had been in the past. They thought mental health issues, which I know George will talk about in a bit. But they didn't really know. They didn't really have hard evidence. And so I think it's imperative upon us, if we want to tackle this problem, to dig in and pull rap sheets of people who are committing these crimes and look at it and see if we can find some themes. Pull arrest records, pull the records of the crimes that are happening there and see actually what's happening, and then develop our response accordingly. And I think because of that, I would also touch on what Adam did, which is something we shouldn't do as a response to violent crime, and that is have a blanket approach that, sweeping policy decisions of the whole country just to address isolated, very serious violent crime problems that we should address. So, for example, building more prisons or taking an aggressive approach to a particular type of crime, like a drug crime. That isn't necessary to address what's happening in Chicago, Baltimore, Houston, San Antonio. And the problem with those blanket pronouncements is that it shifts resources from the most pressing public safety areas to an area that may or may not be making an impact on your community. I know when I was at the Department of Justice, it was our constant struggle every day. A dollar you spent somewhere, for example, in prisons, in prosecuting a low-level offender that could go to state jail, was a dollar that you couldn't spend on terrorism, cyber hacking, child predators, human trafficking, you name it, that were really important priorities that were problems only the federal government could tackle because they're complex cases involving a lot of talent and a lot of resources. And so that resource constraint is a constant struggle. And so focusing every prosecutor in America on a particular type of crime, a particular type of policy means that's one less dollar going into figuring out what's actually happening on the streets of Chicago. And so when I think about the problem, I think it needs to be specific to where it's happening, evidence-based, and very thoughtful.
Thank you, Heather. Excellent comments. Our next panelist is George Terwilliger, who is the co-head of McGuireWoods' white-collar practice and leads the firm's Strategic Response and Crisis Management Practice Group. Former federal prosecutor and U.S. presidential appointee in the Department of Justice during 2 administrations, he has advised government officials, Congress, and private organizations on national security, homeland defense, terrorism, and other public policy and legal issues. Among many notable and high-profile matters, he has handled hundreds of investigations, trials, and appeals, including in white-collar and national security cases as a federal prosecutor. Notably, President Ronald Reagan appointed him as a U.S. attorney, and he continued to serve as Deputy Attorney General and as Acting Attorney General during the George H.W. Bush administration. And I, too, look forward to his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice. You can tell the McGuireWoods marketing people are on the job with that introduction. I'm not going to advocate a solution to the violent crime problem. I'm going to try to provide some information from which you can draw your own conclusions. And all accounting for Heather's very insightful comment concerning pockets of particular increases in violent crime, let me just sort of statistically set the stage a little further. These are Justice Department statistics for percent change in crime stats from 2016 to 2017. All crimes nationally increased just over 9%. Violent crime, 12.7%. Firearms offenses, over 14%. Drug crimes, 6%. Immigration, 15%. I was very happy to hear Adam say that there is a correlation between the rate of incarceration and the crime rate, an inverse correlation. He noted that crime peaked in 1991. I was the Deputy Attorney General in 1991, so I'll take credit for that. That is, that it peaked. I remember very distinctly walking into the office one morning and going up to see the Attorney General, having read an article in the New York Times, yes, I did read the New York Times, about gun violence in America. And I said, you know, we're not using our resources in gun cases the way we ought to be using them. We're indiscriminately taking cases. We ought to do it in a more intelligent manner. And I'll return to that, that thought in a few minutes. What is being done right now? Well, the Attorney General has reinvigorated a program that really existed through the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, called Project Safe Neighborhoods. And that is a smart on crime kind of approach in that it targets for investigation, prosecution, and incarceration, the people who are most responsible for a majority of crimes. I just want to, I know you won't be able to see this, and I apologize that we don't have graphics. I probably should have thought about it. But this is from the Washington Post, and it says 10% of the population commits 63% of all homicides. Think about that, 10% of the population. Well, actually, they were giving more credit to the other 9%. There's a paper from a journal called Social Psychiatry, Psychiatric Epidemiology that concludes that 1% of the population is accountable for 63% of all violent crime convictions. And really, what those studies and reports tell us is something that I think we know, or at least I think most people who are well-versed in law enforcement and criminal justice know, and that is that there is a relatively small percentage of all violent offenders who commit a disproportionate share of all violent crimes. And it seems to me that that is where the correlation, the inverse correlation between incarceration rate and the violent crime rate can be most effectively addressed. And that is, if you can identify who those people are and lock them up for a very long period of time, you neutralize their capability to commit violent crime. I started my career out as an assistant United States attorney here in Washington, D.C., where, as many of you probably know, the U.S. attorney prosecutes street crime, and that's what I did for the first couple of years. And it became very quickly apparent to me that there was a revolving door in the courthouse, and the criminals were the people who went through it the most. You would get people over and over arrested and convicted of violent crimes whose rap sheets were as long as your arm, if not longer. Those people need to be locked up. I think one of the things, we don't have time to go into all this today, but one of the ways that we can do that, in addition to Project Safe Neighborhoods, which basically relies on a partnership between federal authorities and state and local authorities, using the state and local authorities to identify who those people are because they're closest to their communities, and use our federal resources and the federal sentencing and detention statutes that are available to good effect on those people. But in addition to that, we need to look at other ways that we can identify those people other than letting them get 3 convictions and then deciding, oh, they're dangerous, we better lock them up. And there probably are other ways to do that. Finally, I have a lot of other things I'd love to share with you, and I'm sure we'll get some chance on the panel. I do want to talk about, for a moment, mass shootings and mental health. There's a debate, right and left, on this issue. And again, I just want to give you some information that maybe will stimulate some discussion. In 1955, there were 588,000 inpatient mental health beds, in other words, beds for mental health patients in the United States. The population of the United States in that year, 1955, was 165 million. In 2015, there were 45,000 beds, down from 558,000, and 321 million people in the population. Needless to say, I don't think the population's mental health improved that much over the course of that space of time. Now, there are innovative things going on in the field of incapacitating or treating those persons who have a mental disease and defect and are a danger to themselves or others. And that includes what's so-called outpatient supervision. We don't have time to go into the details of that, but we can. But a 90% reduction in inpatient treatment facilities is not something, medication notwithstanding, that's going to help the safety and security of our society. I also remember from my days as an AUSA here, time and time again, fighting the release of defendants who had been found not guilty by reason of insanity, and a few years later, the doctors at the facility where they would be held as a danger to themselves or others say, oh, they're ready to go on the street. Look, they're perfectly fine because they're taking medication. Of course, these people would immediately go on the street and by and large stop taking that medication and return to the state that they were in before, which is not fair to them and not fair to the communities they're in. And then finally, just one other brief word about another factor that we need to take into account, and that is recidivism. We hear a lot about this. Again, I'm relying on Justice Department statistics here. In a study among state prisoners released in 2005 in 30 states, 2/3, that is 67.8% of released prisoners were arrested for a new crime within 3 years, and 3/4 were arrested for a new crime within 5 years. Within 5 years of release, 82% of property offenders were arrested for a new crime, compared to 76% of drug offenders, 73% of public order offenders, and that public order thing has a lot to do with mental health because there's not facilities. You can't leave somebody on the street who's acting out. They wind up in a jail, at least temporarily. And more than a third, 36% of all prisoners who were arrested within 5 years of release were arrested within the first 6 months after relief, with more than half, 56%, being arrested by the end of the year. Suffice it to say we have a recidivism problem in the United States. And again, I'm not saying that there aren't solutions worth looking at in terms of, for example, using the time that we have a captive audience in prison to try to make someone different than they might have been when they entered. But in my estimation, the goal of all criminal justice reform, the first objective needs to be community safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Judge Michael Mukasey, who's a partner at the international law firm Debevoise in Plimpton and teaches spring classes at Columbia Law School. The judge is both a former Attorney General of the United States and the United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York. He's had a long and prominent career, as many of you know, serving 4 years as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and then an additional 18 years as a district judge. In 2007, he was nominated by President Bush as the 81st Attorney General of the United States and was confirmed in November and sworn in days later. We look forward to your unique contributions on this issue, Judge.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the statistics that you've heard, a little bit about some of the terminology that you've heard, and a little bit about some of the history that I've seen coming from New York. First of all, declines in crime rates ought to be examined when they occur very, very carefully. For example, a decline in property crime results often from a degrading of the nature of property crime. If a property crime is not regarded as a felony, as it, for example, is increasingly in California and other places, people don't report property crimes. In fact, a great deal of the statistics about crime relies entirely on the reports by civilians who are the victims of it. If you get into a situation in which enforcement is lax, it becomes futile to report a crime. I would suggest to you that the only really reliable statistic is murder rates, because you've got a body. And other than that, take a good, hard look at whatever statistics you get. Terminology, violent crime. We hear a great deal about nonviolent drug offenders. I would suggest to you that that's an oxymoron. Every drug deal and every drug enterprise relies on either actual violence or the threat of violence in order to survive. You talk to somebody in a neighborhood that is decimated by street corner drug dealing and tell them that what they are experiencing is nonviolent crime, and they will laugh at you. Because that's not what they're experiencing. What they're experiencing is the complete degrading of their lives. So you really, again, need to take a good hard look at the terminology. In New York, back in 1992, we elected a mayor who had this novel idea that he would use the police department to enforce the laws. And he, in particular, had a police commissioner who used what's known as data-driven policing. They kept track of where the crimes were happening and held captains accountable. They also began using stop and frisk technique that dropped gun violence substantially. Not because guns, and we had a lot of articles saying that, well, they're not really confiscating a lot of guns. That wasn't the point of the stop and frisk practice. The point was to have people who, understand, criminals are very risk averse. If they're likely to get stopped, they're likely to leave the gun home. If they leave the gun home, then the situation doesn't escalate. And so the drop in violent crime as a result of stop and frisk was due more to people leaving guns home than it was to the guns that were confiscated. The increase in violent crime that we're experiencing, particularly in cities, I think is due substantially to essentially a war on cops and what has become the highly respectable position that police officers are racists who get up every morning with the intention of harassing minority communities. The result of that is you get less data-driven policing, less aggressive policing. It's a lot easier for a cop to arrive after a crime has been committed and write a report about it than it is for him to get there before a crime has been committed, stop it, and risk the possibility that it's going to be on the evening news for confronting the defendant. My own view is that we may very well have to experience the kind of spike that we had back in 1980 in order to correct that.
Thank you, Judge. Our final speaker is John Baker. He's a visiting professor at Georgetown Law School, also a professor emeritus of law at the Louisiana State University Law School. Areas of interest include constitutional law, criminal law, anti-terrorism law, international law, healthcare law, mediation, and comparative law. Lots of interest. Baker was an assistant district attorney in New Orleans before teaching criminal law for many years and co-authoring a criminal law casebook. He has also served as a consultant to the U.S. Justice Department, a member of the ABA Task Force on the Federalization of Crime, an adjunct fellow at Heritage under former Attorney General Ed Meese, and a consultant to the Bipartisan Task Force on the Over-Federalization of Crime created by the U.S. House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Baker.
Thank you, Justice Stras. Justice Stras said we would go from the general to the specific. I'm last, so I got to be pretty specific. But I want to say that the specific response that I'm going to suggest is a targeted one for the few cities that Heather has identified. And I want to say regarding what George said about the program in justice to target a certain small percentage of the population that commits all the crime. When I was a DA in New Orleans in the 70s, we were doing that under a Justice Department grant on the assumption that there were only 4% of the population that was in this revolving door. And Louisiana had longer sentences than the feds, still does have longer sentences, has probably an amazing incarceration rate in Louisiana. I won't go into how effective all that was. It had some of its problems with it, but it did reduce crime in New Orleans. Of course, it went elsewhere. It's the problem. It's the old burglar problem. Anyway, my point of departure here is about the statement made by President Trump shortly after he was inaugurated, in which he said that if Chicago doesn't fix its homicide carnage, then I'll send in the feds. And then what followed was an executive order regarding a task force on crime and public safety, and then we know that that has been something driving what the Department of Justice is doing. But I pick up what I'm going to talk about with a conversation I had last summer with a bright young lawyer, a member of the Federalist Society, of course, but also working at the highest level in the Justice Department. And so I started to challenge him about, as I usually do, what business does the federal government have in getting into violent crime? That's the responsibility of the states. And part of his response was, well, Mayor Emanuel really likes what we're doing. Well, how's that working out? Not long after, when the executive order came out on sanctuary cities, what did Mayor Emanuel do? he sued the Department of Justice for depriving them of resources. Now, did he mention his gratitude for the resources that they were bringing in? I didn't see it in the press release. What happened last week? Chicago and 10 other cities became part of the SAFE project. You know what the SAFE project is? It is to provide publicly paid for attorneys for illegal immigrants. The premise is that it will reduce crime by getting them back with their families. Now, it is true that it has been shown that when they have lawyers, the chance of staying in the country is 10 times higher. Now, I'm not objecting to their having lawyers, but if it's a resource problem, as Heather talked about, why are you diverting your resources here when your primary obligation is to public safety of your citizens? That's the first responsibility of local government. So, what's my targeted solution? Well, I would suggest that President Trump tweet or otherwise communicate to the Illinois legislature and to the governor, that he is willing to send in the military if Chicago can't do anything about its domestic violence, because we have what's called the Domestic Violence Clause in the Constitution. So what I want to do very quickly, explain it, and that's tough shortly to do. 2, explain what happened to George Bush when he offered it after Katrina to the governor of Louisiana. And 3, this will force incompetent, irresponsible cities and states to focus on the state and not the cities. Explaining it. How many have ever heard of the Domestic Violence Clause? Don't all go up at once. Okay. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, it's in the same section as the Guarantee Clause, continues, and shall protect each of them, the states, against invasion. There's no requirement of state permission on invasion or insurrection. And on application of the legislature or the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. It was both a states' rights, if you will, question to affirm that the states have the responsibility over the police power, but it was also a recognition that under certain circumstances, the states might need help. Now, there's a modification to this after the 14th Amendment and the Ku Klux Klan Act that allowed, in order to protect citizens against violations of the Equal Protection Clause, for the federal government to go in without the permission of the state because it was against the state. But this did not change the Domestic Violence Clause itself. But there's problems, there's confusion here because there really hasn't been much clarification from the Supreme Court. The only real case we have on it that doesn't help is Luther v. Borden. So what happened when this came up after Katrina? And the reason I'm doing this is not just because we're going to have more natural disasters, but because if it's not clear who's in charge, when we either have a natural disaster or increasingly as we have terrorist attacks, when we're not sure whether it is a mental health problem where somebody is killing people or whether it is a terrorist problem, it is very important to figure out who's in charge. So what happened after Katrina? The governor of Louisiana asked for 40,000 troops, but she didn't specify anything. The president said, yeah, I'll help, but you've got to turn authority over to me. That's the way it works. Oh, no, she wouldn't do that. So what happened? This is from the president's book. So he's there with the mayor, the governor. He says, who's in charge of security in New Orleans? My questions silenced the raucous discussion on Air Force One. What happened? The mayor says the governor's in charge. The governor says the mayor's in charge. Nobody's in charge. That's the problem. That's the problem. The other way to look at the Domestic Violence Clause is not just that states have the authority over violent crime, They have the responsibility to protect their people. It's first of all the city. It is second of all the state. This provision should force the states to be accountable. They're not. States have the authority over the cities. Cities have no standing under the Constitution. We protect states against unlawful use of federal power. We don't protect cities necessarily. So what I'm suggesting is that this would put some order in understanding that states have to be clear in this because we are facing more and more emergencies. And when you look at the so-called Insurrection Act and the idea that is current among some people that the president needs no permission from the state to send in the troops for virtually anything. Fortunately, they haven't done that. But that's the view of some people. We're going to get to a crisis at some point, and before it's time to think about it, there will be a knee-jerk reaction, and we will have the militarization of certain areas. I'm against the militarization. The military is against the militarization. But if we don't force states to force their cities to be responsible, those few cities where we have this spike is due to the fact they're not governing their cities. People should be made to understand that self-government requires control at the local level. If you're not going to control it, some higher level is going to have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Very provocative comments. I thought, since my fellow panelists, and I appreciate this, very much kept to the time limits, I wanted to give, and there are a lot of ideas expressed that I think are quite important. I thought it'd be great to give each of the panelists sort of a minute or two, and we'll try to keep to that so we can get to the questions, to respond to anything that they found troubling, profound, want to emphasize, et cetera. And we'll start with Adam.
Okay. Thanks. Just two things. We have baseball statistics like you can't believe. We don't know anything about crime, right? If you just watch the World Series, they can tell you this was this guy's batting average when there was somebody on second and third base, when the temperature was between 76 and 79 degrees and it was drizzling. Not raining, drizzling. It's all in some database. And despite the efforts of a gentleman to my left and lots of others at the federal level, this is a city and a state issue. It's really bad how little we know about things. That said, there are two measures of crime. There are crimes reported to police that are put out by the FBI each year that we all know as the Uniform Crime Reports, and those were the figures that we were referring to earlier. There's a second measure of crime across the country that another arm of the Justice Department does, which is the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is actually a survey of people and asks them about their victimization rates of thousands of households around the country. And it asks them to report on this survey whether they were victimized, regardless of whether or not they reported that crime to police or not. So it sort of isolates this issue of whether offenses have been degraded and people don't think it's worth reporting anymore. And the neat thing about that is that those numbers have been coming down dramatically as well. In fact, in the survey, both violent crime and property crime are down by more than the crimes reported to police. So that was one point I wanted to make. The second is that I think there's a lot of unanimity on this panel about one important thing we haven't quite articulated at all yet, but that is that if the goal is public safety and the goal is to deter people from committing crimes, then whether you're talking about policing or you're talking about prisons at the back end of the system, the key thing is swiftness and certainty and not severity. If you want to change people's behavior, you've got to understand that it's much more important to catch them and catch them quickly after they've committed a crime and to try to raise the likelihood that people think they are going to be caught, particularly for offenders who just tend to be a lot more present-oriented and not so much about deferring gratification. They discount the future heavily. So locking somebody up for that 7th year rather than 5 or 6 years is not part of their calculation when they're thinking about whether to break into that car and steal the iPad from the seat. So things that we can do to help support police in increasing the likelihood and swiftness with which people are caught and prosecuted much more important than tacking on extra time at the end of a prison sentence.
Thank you. Heather?
Yes. Well, I was actually very heartened to, if I heard everybody correctly, see that we do agree on a couple of pretty fundamental things, which is that we need to be spending time on the worst of the worst and targeting our resources on those who commit the worst crimes and the most crimes. And I think that's true from a resources perspective and an effectiveness perspective. And if I heard everyone correctly, I think that's a great thing that we agree on that, and I think a lot of law enforcement would as well. A couple of specific things I wanted to address. George, you talked about recidivism. I could not agree more that is such an important thing for us to focus on. You mentioned that state recidivism rates are 2/3 of prisoners released commit crimes afterwards. In the federal system, it's 40% of federal prisoners who are released commit crimes later. And those are too high. And so I know that when I was at the Department of Justice, we put a lot of effort into programs in the Federal Bureau of Prisons that were proven evidence-based wise to reduce recidivism. And I think that's very important to, like you said, do some real work when you have a captive audience, because prisons or the corrections industry is really a law enforcement job. It is a fundamental public safety job to prevent crime on the back end. So I completely agree with that. The last thing I wanted to address is the Ferguson effect, which Judge Mukasey, you touched on a bit, namely that right now police departments feel under siege and are therefore pulling back on their enforcement efforts because they feel under siege. I completely agree with you that I'm sure there are individual law enforcement officers in this country who feel that way and don't act a certain way at a stop and arrest or whatever because they're worried about how they would be perceived later on. I will be reminded, though, that when the Ferguson effect the term was first coined after Michael Brown died in Ferguson, Missouri, it was the police chief of St. Louis who used that word, and he actually wasn't referring exactly to that. He was referring to the fact that he had sent his police department there in St. Louis to Ferguson to deal with the massive problems they were dealing with there, and therefore the police weren't on the street in St. Louis, and so criminals figured that out and thought that they could get away with stuff, and that increased the crime rate there. Since that time, the Ferguson effect has been used to describe this police pullback. When other police chiefs and our former FBI director used that term publicly to maybe, speculate that was a reason for violent crime, the Fraternal Order of Police, which is the organization comprised of our rank and file officers, the cops on the beat throughout the country, were livid because they found it so offensive, the comment, or the idea that they would not fulfill their obligation and their sworn oath to protect and serve because they were under scrutiny and held to a different standard. And I remember talking with the director of the FOP at the time and many other law enforcement officers who just adamantly took huge dispute with that idea. So I don't know if it's true or not, because the evidence isn't there either way. But that's how they felt about it. So I just wanted to address those two specific things.
Thank you, Heather. George?
Thank you. I'd like to address a little element of stop and frisk as an example of we can't look at law enforcement and criminal justice programs in isolation if we're trying to discover both the means to reduce violent crime and obstacles to the reduction of violent crime. Michael mentioned the success that New York had with its stop and frisk program. We sort of have the opposite phenomena going on in Chicago right now. I, last year or so ago, chaired a group of former prosecutors and former police officials who have expertise in the area of deadly force policy and how police departments deal with officer-involved shootings, and learned a number of things, most of which I can't talk about because that was a client matter. What I just told you is public. But we did talk to a lot of police officers there, both before and after. As a result of a consent decree entered between or negotiated between the Justice Department in the last administration and the city of Chicago, when a Chicago police officer has any encounter with a citizen today, that officer has to fill out a multi-page form, a detailed multi-page form. Now, again, I don't pretend to be an academic expert on all these things by any means, but I do like to try to take a common sense approach to this. If a police officer is sitting in his car and sees somebody that, based on his training, experience, knowledge of the neighborhood, and so forth, is acting in a way that maybe a police encounter would do some good, and he has a choice between getting out of the car, and it is cold in Chicago in the wintertime, and confronting that individual to see what's going on, and staying in his car, and therefore avoiding having to fill out a 6-page form, what do you think is going to happen on a lot of those occasions? So criminal justice policy is built on more than just criminal justice policy. It also has to do with how we deal with the policing function in general and in other ways. I'd also like to just talk a little bit about something that Heather didn't really mention directly, but we both talked about when you have people in prison, is it an opportunity to perhaps give them the opportunity to change their lives? You know, we're not going to fix people. People are going to fix themselves if they want to. But we might be able to give them the opportunity to do that. And in what you said, Heather, you said programs that are proven to reduce recidivism. I think that is one of the most important missions of the Office of Justice Programs today. It's not just to think up programs, but it's to measure their results. Things that work, wonderful. If they don't work, we're just wasting our citizens' money. And too many of these programs that have been alternatives to imprisonment have really just shifted the cost from building and maintaining prisons to other parts of the government and indeed to the safety of the community in ways that, you know, maybe make some of us feel good but don't really accomplish anything.
Judge?
3 points. One, with regard to the effectiveness of programs, I think one thing that you really need to do is to figure out which programs work across the board, if any, and which programs work because they carefully screen who participates. I'm in favor of those programs. I'm in favor of screening people if it works. But if you have a prison population that consists of N and you're simply allowing 25% of N to participate in the program, then you're going to find that the other 75% don't show any improvement. I certainly agree with Adam that swiftness and certainty outweighs severity, particularly at the tail end of a sentence. We want to save a lot of money. We could save a lot of money by releasing older prisoners who are far more costly to house, far more costly to maintain, and who, the last 5 years of a 20-year sentence or a 25-year sentence, I don't know, has any incremental value at all. I think that'll do it. Thank you.
John.
I think it's very difficult to generalize in terms of policy because I did a study as part of a bigger group years ago on plea bargaining, and we went different places. And when you look at the different procedures and laws from state to state, and you try to find out what's causing certain results in this area, you realize that the states are very different as they were designed to be. And where I place, certainly in the criminal justice part of it, meaning in the courts, a lot of it depends upon your judges, your prosecutors, and your defense attorneys, what type of people they are. By this I mean a lot of them, some of them don't work as hard as others, say judges. Some judges in some places think it's a retirement, and they don't want to try cases, some of them. And witnesses get frustrated when cases are continued and continued, and they're continued because the lawyer hasn't been paid yet. You know, there are so many things that go into the mess that I find that the policy prescriptions often have an element of truth, but largely won't work for all kinds of local reasons. Thank you.
All right, we will move on to audience questions, and I'm going to have to look. We've got them at every podium, so we'll start right here with a long line and move our way around the room.
Thank you, Carl Donald from South Florida. Short question. Have any of you looked at the relationship between high rates of violent crime and gun control legislation?
Anyone want to take that one?
Have not.
I haven't either.
Okay. All right, we'll go over to this side of the room over here to the right. My right.
I'd like to hear the panel's view on incarceration for so-called victimless crimes like drug possession as opposed to distribution. And also, when we're talking about recidivism, the issue of the ability of a convicted felon to get a job when he gets out of jail, if he is willing to work, but who is going to hire him?
I know we talked a little bit about the first question on our call, but I'll turn it over to whoever wants to field that one, or several of you.
I have never, well, I understand I was in the federal system. I never saw, I don't mean occasionally, I never saw anybody imprisoned for drug possession. I did see many charges of drug sale bargained down to simple possession for reasons having very little to do with what actually happened. The notion of there being a large number of people in jail for drug possession, I think is ridiculous. I don't think it happens on the state level. It certainly doesn't happen on the federal level. So far as employability of felons, I agree that that's an enormous problem. There are many trades and professions that control licensing in order to diminish the ability of people to enter the workforce. And one of the ways in which they do it is to make licenses for things that people in jail might do when they get out, like fix automobiles or cut hair, difficult to get. And that's a problem.
Well, I can give you a personal story on that. Years ago, I had a case where the defendant was on his fourth charge of drinking paregoric. You know, they put that on gums of babies when they're teething. No other record. And under, you know, the fourth strike, he was to go to life imprisonment. And I went to my superiors. I said, look, I can't do this. I cannot put this guy away for life for drinking paregoric. And the answer initially was, look, he's white, and we're being charged with being racist for our crackdown on crime. If we give this guy a break, you know, all hell's going to break loose. I got it knocked down to 3 from 4. He didn't do life, but he did a lot longer than he should have for what he did. The difficulty in all of this is defense attorneys always want mercy. And when you give anybody mercy, then they're saying you're unfair. And that's the constant struggle when you're dealing with these issues at the local level.
Heather, I know you wanted to talk as well.
Just for a second, in the federal system, I completely agree with Judge Mukasey that as an ideal matter, the feds would not be going after these low-level drug crimes and instead would only go after the high-level drug trafficking, kingpins, like violent street gangs, et cetera. A couple of years ago, when I was involved in the launch of Attorney General Holder's Smart on Crime initiative, we did a review of what cases were actually in the federal system, and there were pockets of these isolated cases that never should have been charged federally. They weren't in New York. They were in sort of smaller jurisdictions throughout the country. And we also discovered through looking at that different parts of the country used what are called 851 enhancements. Many of you probably know what these are in a very different manner. There were some districts, and what they are is you can charge 1 and get a sentence gone from 10 to 20 years, and then 2 to mandatory life if you have 1 or 2 prior drug trafficking crimes, which could be a simple sale. And we found that there were a handful of districts that used these in every single case, and we had a disproportionate number of old-timers in federal prison serving life that never should have been there for that long. And so part of what we were doing with our charging policy is to try to streamline and mitigate that. So while it shouldn't exist in the federal system, it does. One example is a case that I looked at where a guy had a 6th grade education. He served in the Army, was honorably discharged, had a drug problem, sold crack on the street twice, had 2 state drug, crack sale convictions for that. And then the 3rd time was charged federally and had a mandatory life sentence. And that's all he had on his record. So it does exist. Your second point about jobs for the formerly incarcerated, I agree it's a huge problem. In the federal system, there's a program called Federal Prison Industries that gives job training to defendants so that they can learn some of the skills that Judge Mukasey talked about so that they can get jobs later. It's also shown to reduce recidivism by 26% participation in this program. But it's still, even for those people who have had immaculate prison records, it's proven to reduce recidivism, it's still really hard for them to get jobs afterwards. And so that's something that we should invest in and really look at because it's crime prevention.
Adam, you wanted to just briefly comment as well.
I did just a quick point of information that is absolutely right, at least at the state level, very few people in prison for drug possession. The total number of drug offenders, 16%, drug possession, 4%, and many of those may in fact have started out as trafficking cases. Yep. That said, please keep in mind the main way that people get into prison or jail right now for drug possession or drug use type offenses is for using drugs while on parole and probation and being violated back to or revoked back to jail or prison for that probation or parole violation. In some states, we have 50, upwards of 60% of all prison admissions being for technical violations of supervision rules, including drug use. And about half of those, in many states, are related to drugs. So that's the main way. And states are actually dealing with it, trying to figure out ways to hold people accountable for abiding by the rules and staying clean, and to coerce and incentivize them into staying off of drugs, and using other types of sanctions short of incarceration to do that.
Go ahead, Judge.
2 points. Number one, although I never like to reject a compliment, part of what you said was not what I was saying. In fact, I think sweeps in some neighborhoods that pick up what were referred to as low-level drug dealers, we can debate what that means, will often result in substantial improvement. We had a program in New York in which every week they would declare Federal Day. Didn't tell folks on the street which day it was, but it would be Federal Day, and everybody picked up in a particular neighborhood, instead of being taken to the revolving door down the street, was taken to the federal court. The improvement in neighborhoods as a result of that was palpable and dramatic. And what it showed is that you can get to people by having a swift, certain system in which people, when they come to court, who are selling drugs and degrading neighborhoods, are held. I recall having a lawyer tell me that he thought I should admit his client to bail because if he was across the street, he would have been out before his client appeared before me. I said, if you read the lintel over the door when you leave, you'll notice it says United States Courthouse. It doesn't say the true administration of justice is the firmest pillar of good government, which is what it says over on the state court, where they have a revolving door and let everybody out. He understood the point.
John, briefly, because I want to move on to other questions. But
on neighborhoods, there's a group in Dallas that I can't remember the name of. They've been featured in Forbes. What they're doing is going in with civil actions after crack houses and getting them condemned, and they've had a lot of success in reducing crime rates in those neighborhoods.
Thank you. All right, we'll go over to this side of the room.
I wanted to take a tangent off of Professor Baker's point to really the rest of the panelists. Everyone agrees that there should be more targeting. That's sort of a commonsensical approach that really has improved over the past 20 years. My question is, who should be doing the targeting? As it's been enunciated and discussed here, aren't we undermining democratic accountability? There's nothing easier than if you are a city council person in Baltimore or a state legislator in Utah to simply pass the buck and let the federal government engage in deficit spending to put people away for felon in possession. And what the Department of Justice gets then is to run its stats up. We had this many felon possessions, we had this many low-level local drug distributions. If there's supposed to be a balance, a federal-state balance, how is the department not completely overstepping that bound by, in essence, taking over local crime and paying for what voters should be deciding? If you're a voter in Utah, why shouldn't you decide, I want to pay to incarcerate somebody for 20 years for using a gun, instead of having the taxpayers writ large borrow money to do it?
Who wants to take that one?
I'm singing my song, so I won't say it.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and you raise a good point. I think there's a couple of things to consider that are responsive to the issue you identify, which is a good one. One is, looked at from a very practical level, you're the United States Attorney in New York, or in some other city where there's a great deal of violence. Well, I'll give the example of Richmond, Virginia, 30 years ago, which was the murder capital of the United States for a while, as Chicago is now. And for whatever reason, the state system is not getting it done. You have two choices. You can do nothing and allow your community to continue to be victimized and further degraded, or you can bring federal resources to bear and start to do something about it. I have no quarrel with the U.S. Attorney, supported by the Justice Department, who takes that step. But that being said, that's far from a permanent solution. And part of the design behind the program that I was talking about to recalibrate how we used federal gun prosecutions, and that still is baked into the Project Safe Neighborhoods approach today, is in fact partnership with the state and locals. If for whatever reason the state does not see fit to say you can get up to life if you have 3 prior violent felony convictions and possess a firearm, and the federal government does, as a Federalist, I'm troubled, but as a pragmatist, I'm supportive of the notion that asking the local DAs and the local police authorities to say, bring us those cases, bring us the worst of the worst. We will make the judgment about which cases we're actually going to prosecute, but we will help reduce crime in this community by attacking those types of offenders.
Actually, part of the point of those programs, though, is supposed to be to teach the locals that it's doable, and to keep them from throwing up their hands. If they won't learn that lesson, there's no way to force feed it.
I don't disagree with that, General Mukasey, and I think it's a balance that has to be struck. But doing nothing is not an option. For sure.
All right, let's go back to the center.
Okay, thank you. Mary DeGennaro. I serve on an intermediate court of appeals in Ohio. And to the panelists' point, yes, we do see with some regularity trafficking or other kind of offenses pled down to possession. We also see in our docket, and in Ohio you have an appeal as of right. A lot of our criminal cases involve drugs to some extent, be it people feeding their habit or straight up drug trafficking and the like. I'd be curious to hear the panel's thoughts on drug courts, mental health courts, and other specialty dockets. We have a very strong tradition in Ohio with those kinds of programs to kind of address some of the underlying problems and to address recidivism. So I would welcome your thoughts on that as well.
We also have those in Minnesota. So I guess the question is, what role do specialty courts play in this?
I'll try to be a little bit provocative on this, and I'm sure there are other judges in the room who have similar experiences and whatnot. I'm of two minds about that. I don't think we want to make our courts social service agencies. And just as we, unfortunately, are making the police first responders in the opioid crisis for overdoses, that's also troubling. It's not the job of judges to supervise a person's life and how they avail themselves or not of programs. The pragmatist in me, though, says it's been demonstrated that those things work in some instances. The problem is that we create things like drug courts to solve what ought to be a temporary problem, even if temporary is 30 or 40 years, but they never go away. And in the process, we condition our society and the constituents in that community to a change in the role of courts that I don't think we've thought out the consequences of that very well.
I think drug courts are fantastic because they have been proven to work and reduce recidivism, but the problem is scalability. I mean, if you work at a drug court yourself, it takes so much time and effort on the part of the judge and the prosecutor and the public defender and, most importantly, the probation officer. and or a pretrial services officer who works on it, and I don't know how you scale that. It's something we struggled with at the Department of Justice, and by the time I left, we did not have an answer. It works very well in the very limited circumstances in which you have the committed individuals.
And to your point, George, about social services, we did kind of briefly have that conversation in Ohio, but it was after the horse was out of the barn, and we were seeing these types of things take off, and it's like, well, should we have really done this in the first place? So those thoughts were considered as well.
All right, we'll go over to this side of the room, over to my right.
Thank you. On the topic of conditioning society, I wonder if the abdication of state and local responsibility is in any way correlated with the expansion of federal criminal law that might signal to locals that the feds are going to take care of something and that they don't need to worry about it. And then, I guess depending on how the panel answers that, do you think that there might be value in repealing federal criminal laws as a way to signal to states that it's back on them, as a reversal of maybe threatening overwhelming force through Article 4?
What do you think?
Well, I've written about how, we have 5,000 crimes. We have way too many crimes. And the problem at the federal level is they can only actually prosecute such a tiny sliver of what theoretically is crime. I mean, literally everyone can be indicted for something. It's true. I mean, as Scalia said when in the honest services case, when it came up, if you lie to your boss and you go to the game instead, you're guilty of honest services fraud. Now the court, cut it back a little bit, but still, that's the problem. Federal criminal laws are just way, way too broad, and they cover virtually everything. So, again, I take it back to the local level. A lot of it depends upon the particular DA and the particular U.S. attorney, and sometimes there are struggles, sometimes they work together.
I agree that it's a question of balance that really comes down to being intelligent about the choices in terms of the kind of cases you take. And there is kind of a balance being struck. I think your point that we can condition society to accept that this federal Leviathan is going to get even bigger than it is, in part by usurping criminal justice responsibilities. But Professor Baker, Dr. Baker is exactly right. It'll never really happen because the federal resources are so limited. It's always going to remain primarily a state and local thing. I see it up close here as a citizen today. There's a tremendous problem with the MS-13 gang in the Washington metropolitan area. And within the past 6 months, I've seen 2 major cases brought. One was a case brought by one of the U.S. attorneys from the jurisdiction around here that involved human trafficking. The other one was a murder case that was brought out in Fairfax County, just tried in the last couple of weeks, and people convicted of murdering a 14-year-old girl in a most brutal and violent way. So I think it's a matter of violence. In terms of I've been talking about over-criminalization generally on the federal level for 20 years. That's a real problem. There's no question about it. I do think, actually, while the idea of getting Congress to repeal laws may almost be laughable at the outset, there is something like that going on. Certainly, Congress is today looking at aspects of Dodd-Frank and saying, wait a minute, maybe we went too far, and starting to roll that back. I think as soon as we solve some other major problems, doing that sort of thing would be a good idea. But the Justice Department has a role in that as well. The Justice Department makes too many business crime cases. I'm straying far afield here, I guess, but just to answer, too many business crime cases based on statutes of general application like 18 U.S.C. 1001, false statements, or conspiracy to defraud the United States by impeding and impairing an agency function. Basing those cases on prosecutors' interpretation of regulatory standards that are often ambiguous. We could roll that practice back as a start.
Any other comments? All right, we will move over to this side of the room.
Teresa Kale. I was a mental health nurse for 20 years before I became an attorney. I'm still involved in mental health. That means I'm a behavioralist. And I would like someone on the panel to please discuss, in terms of criminal law, how hate crimes have altered the perceptions of what we're doing.
Go ahead.
I've written on hate crimes. First of all, it's a bogus term, just like white-collar crime. These are labels that sociologists have put on crimes. Look, when you talk about a felony and the mens rea that is necessary at common law felony, it involved hate. Why are people talking about hate? Because they're not looking at the mens rea, which is intent. They're looking at the motive, which is wrong. That's one thing. And two, we have so many strict liability offenses that involve no mens rea. So if you want to put a mens rea back in, then I guess you call it a hate crime.
Other comments? Yep.
Huh? What's that?
But the law now acknowledges that, and it did not before, correct?
Acknowledges it in what sense? In this, sentencing is a whole other can of worms, okay?
But that is the can of worms that I think I'm trying to refer to.
Well,
Let's let the judge respond. I know he has something to say.
I think hate crimes are bogus as well, and I think they are largely the result of reaction by legislators and an attempt to create protected groups within society. If you are a member of a particular group and you are the victim of a crime, it'll be prosecuted one way. If you're part of the general population, it'll be prosecuted another. I see absolutely no sense in that when it's the same crime.
All right, I've been trying to keep track of sort of where people have been lining up. Senator's next.
Paul Kamenar, Washington attorney and senior fellow of the Administrative Conference. And I think George maybe already touched on what I was going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. Since the whole theme of this three-day conference is administrative state, and this panel dealt with more of street crime, there is that problem of criminalizing regulatory conduct, where Professor Baker's written a lot, where you have basically 200,000 regulations which can be addressed or remedied either administratively before an ALJ at an agency, civilly in federal civil court, or DEFCON 1 going to criminal court. And Heather, I'm sure at the Justice Department, you have to look at how the prosecutors exercise that discretion. Exhibit A, there's the CEO, CFO, and the General Counsel in prison today for their different interpretation of a Medicare reimbursement provision, which easily could have been addressed civilly, administratively, yet we had 200 FBI agents go in, prosecutorial resources used to get a conviction on a lower standard of mens rea. So how do we address that over-criminalization at the federal level for these regulatory administrative offenses?
Tough question. You want to field it?
I'll field it.
All right.
I think it's a violation of separation of powers to allow the executive branch to effectively create crimes. The job of Congress is to create the statute and the penalty, and Congress wants to do everything it can to avoid accountability, and you always will have an administrative agency willing to help them out by taking the responsibility, quote, for which they're not accountable. That's the fundamental problem of the administrative state.
All right.
I'll address that a little bit. Well, the law creates the crime, and then the regulatory standard and a lot of these things sort of just define the details after the crime is created. And most of these regulatory crimes are misdemeanors, by the way. And I'll give an example of one and sort of show the purpose behind it, one that was prosecuted a couple of years ago. And that was of a food grower and manufacturer who knowingly distributed cantaloupes that were laced with E. coli and killed several dozen people. So and the reason for that particular crime, even though it interpreted the food and safety regulations as sort of part of the indictment, was it placed the onus on the people who are in the most control of the actual food safety that could have dire consequences on the rest of the population. And as a society, if we choose to make that a misdemeanor, I think that's perfectly warranted.
The problem, though, is I'll just use a classic example that's been many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with an environmental crime. polluting is not a crime. Congress has never made polluting a crime. In fact, it's given the EPA the authority to give people permits to do it. So people pollute all the time. There are limits, however, that EPA can place on pollution, and they're usually measured in parts per million. And a mistake or a mischaracterization, an intentional mischaracterization of a report under a permit can be a felony, and people go to jail for it. While experts disagree about the minutia of what those regulations require. There are examples across the board in terms of the federal regulatory state. That is not the stuff of criminal law, in my opinion.
All right, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here for just a moment. And, you know, one of the things that struck me about this panel is we've talked about a whole host of subjects, which I think is good. But I want to do something a little unusual and ask each panelist, if they would, to sort of give me one idea, whether it be a solution, a research topic, a problem, whatever it may be, that folks in the audience can take with them in analyzing sort of this general topic of rising violent crime rates. And that way, everyone can leave knowing just a few things or a couple of things that are really important in this field. And we'll sort of start in reverse order and go to John first. He's probably looking at me going, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that Heather's point about the isolation of the rise in crime in certain cities it is an important point to spread, because when DOJ comes out and says we have this rising crime problem all over the country, ordinary citizens think it's everywhere. And I think that that sends the wrong message, first of all, in terms of it could frighten people unnecessarily, one. And two, it doesn't focus on the problem. The problem are in certain cities whether or not, in fact, doing their basic job to protect people.
Judge.
I think that there are only about 15 or 16, I think, but there are consent decrees in effect in some cities that essentially make the federal government the overseer of the police departments. And those often result from a situation in which there is a violent confrontation between a member of a minority group and the police, and the Justice Department then swoops in behind it and threatens prosecution. By and large, those municipalities, cities, are governed by Democrats, and so they will agree to a consent decree that then puts the police under a federal constraint, and the result invariably has been a spike in crime. We can cut out a lot of that by paring some of that back.
George.
How do you get out of those consent decrees?
I'd like to go back to the question of the connection between mental health and mass violence. One of the things you see if you just sort of take a cursory look at some of what's contemporaneously being written about there is some pushback within elements of the mental health treatment community that, well, there really is no relationship here. That mental health treatment and procedures are not the solution to mass violence. Even some arguing that the way mental illness is defined as to people who do some of these things is questionable. I'm sorry, somebody that walks into a church and shoots children on a Sunday morning is mentally ill. And somebody knew that and probably encountered that individual. I would love to see a strong effort, probably having to be led by the federal government, unfortunately, on a policy level, to bring together social service agencies, mental health professionals, the law enforcement community, and prosecutors to try to figure out a way to identify people that are, in fact, in need of mental health treatment. It happens to be the humane thing to do with people with mental illness, by the way, and get the system of involuntary commitment, which we have developed to a fine degree in terms of a legal procedure in the United States. In Addington v. Texas, the Supreme Court basically blessed the standards under due process for involuntary commitments and get people into the treatment modes that will help them and prevent them from, at least in some cases, committing these mass acts of violence.
then as an aside, when I was at the Department of Justice, most heads of law enforcement groups, especially sheriffs, would always say that the mental health crisis was their top concern, always. The takeaway for me is that we all agree that there are isolated pockets of an increase in violent crime. It's a very serious problem, and we should address it, but we shouldn't do it through a broken windows approach. We shouldn't do it by mandating all prosecutors charge the most serious readily provable offense in every case, that they do it by targeting every person who sells drugs on the street, and instead it should be done through a targeted, evidence-based approach that focuses on the worst of the worst criminals and get them off the street.
Adam. I guess I'd like to end on a note of optimism.
I like that.
I feel like we know so much more today than we did when we had the last sort of major rise in crime in the 1980s. There's really been an explosion of research, not stats about really what's going on in real time, but research about what actually works in policing, what works to change behavior of offenders, and almost more importantly, in the States, maybe not so much here inside the Beltway where the political atmosphere is quite poisonous, but in states that are closer to the problem, and even in some of these cities, there really is starting to be an increased awareness of this research and an increased willingness to look to the research and data to figure out how to most effectively address these problems and not solve them by anecdote and emotion the way we have in the past.
Thank you. I want to make sure to get everybody off so that they can get there for what's sure to be a great dinner and a great presentation by Justice Gorsuch. But before we do, I want to give a big round of applause to our panelists who are terrific. And thank you so much for coming. Yeah. No, thanks for. No, my pleasure. You guys did fantastic. Nice. It was really interesting.
Great,
one second.
tough questions.
There were, and we didn't go too far afield, which is good.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Mr. Gelb? Mr. Gelb? Yes. I did step out of the room when you were saying it. I don't know if you brought this up. You were looking at some other reasons why crime went down that maybe